Welcome to the Writers Are People Too podcast, where you might just find that you shouldn't meet the writer of your heroes. Tonight, we have with us a returning guest for the second time, Darrell Epp. And so, Darrell, thank you for coming on. The last time we had you on was for the anthology, the science fiction anthology by Quire Publishing, and that was Augmented Volume 1. So appreciate you coming on for that. It was a great conversation. If you haven't seen that yet, check it out. But for those of you who are unfamiliar with you, just give us a little rundown on yourself.
I'm a writer. I live by the western shore of Lake Ontario, and it's a place that has been described as being similar to Baltimore or Pittsburgh. It's called Hamilton, Ontario. It's sort of a steel town that has lost a lot of its steel jobs due to automation. So it's a big question that's not unique to here. What do you do when, tens of millions of men in the Western Hemisphere don't have meaningful work? So it's going under a transition that is not unique to here. So I found that the cliche in writing is that the more specific you get, the more universal you get. So when you read a story by Anton Chekhov, you start to cry, not because you are also a shoemaker in Siberia or whatever, but because he's talking about something that we all have in common: loss, love, dreams that didn't come true. So where I live informs my writing a lot. I worked in the theater in the 1990s, writing plays and training actors. Then I wrote different sorts of things. And then when I went to poetry, as it turned out, that's when things kind of clicked. So my sixth poetry collection is what we're talking about tonight, published by Quire. And I have found that poetry is just fantastic, and it's needed now more than ever. And poetry can do all sorts of amazing tricks that other forms of expression can't. It's a great way to talk about what it's like to be alive. It has the power to simulate consciousness and actual capture moments better than other forms, I think. And poetry is eternal. Homer and Isaiah said things thousands of years ago that are still true today. So I'm just having a good time with it.
Awesome. Well, that was a very in-depth, basically introduction to all the questions that I have outlined for you. So I'm glad we're kind of on the same page. We're going to get into some of those in a few minutes here. But before we do that, I actually want to go back to something you were just saying a second ago about AI and automation and job loss.
Yes.
Perhaps we come at this from a different perspective because we're artists and we are doing this in our free time right now, nonetheless. But a lot of people feel like when AI comes and takes everybody's jobs, there's going to be a loss of meaning for everybody. Do you find that to be true, or do you think people will manage to find meaning anyway?
Okay. I feel like I should be taking notes right now because there's a few different directions we have to go there. First off, if you want my hot take on AI, that'll take up the next 4 hours, right? And I know people who are AI doomers, very much so. People who work in the field who say it is going to be the end of all of us. And I don't agree with that at all. First off, just in a practical sense, hope is a virtue and despair is always a vice, whatever's going on in the world. So I don't get doomers or negativity at all. And for AI to take over the world, it seems like all these doomsday fantasies are predicated on electricity being eternally reliable and cheap. And I don't know why people would make that assumption, So I think the future is going to be awesome. And the funny thing about...
Well, so let's pause right there because I immediately remember this amazing quote that you had during our last interview.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to paraphrase you, but you said, the science fiction of the 20th century basically lied to us. And they said there's going to be all these great things. And now that we're here in the 21st century, it's not. But here
Heck
you
yeah.
sound like you're very optimistic. So what leads you to that optimism?
Well, first off, I think being optimistic is always the smart choice. Like like your future doesn't exist yet. Like you make it, so it's in your
Hmm.
best interest to tell yourself good things about it. Um, uh, but it is true that you know, like I mean, great men throughout like you want to be a great man, and to be a great man you have to overcome challenges, and that's what great men have done throughout history. And when you read great literature, you're sort of reminded that guess what, you're a human being, and you're part of this race that has done amazing things. And all these, um, when Honoré de Balzac was my age, he'd written 99 novels. And for example, you're part of the human race that has done amazing things. Like that should thrill you and make you want to be a great person. So I'm telling you, your future is going to be awesome. And I, I just keep on thinking that a great antidote to whatever is going on in current events that only exists to make you agitated and feel helpless is to go back to the ancient literature of the past, where you can plug into great men, but also be reminded that, you know, people have been talking to you about the end of the world literally for 10,000 years. Some of the oldest written artifacts we have of the human race say the golden age is over, everything's going downhill. Literally. So I always find the end of the world stuff kind of corny, personally. So it is true, but at the same time, one thing that my books do talk about is the disconnect between what science fiction of the 20th century promised us and the way we're living now, right? Like, for example, when they said on the Jetsons TV show, you would have a maid to do your housework, right? So if you
Where
were
is
like a
she? I'm
middle
waiting.
class person, you could afford robots to do these drudgery, right? And unfortunately now, like I have literally had the first-hand experience of having my career taken away from me by a robot arm, but I still have to clean my own kitchen, right? That wasn't the deal, right?
Yeah.
So, and also, of course, you know, um, in the science fiction of the 20th century, they never dared to suggest that in the future the divide between haves and have-nots would still exist, right? Um, or that human nature would have these immutable characteristics, right? You know, uh, J.G. Ballard, who's who's the only science fiction writer who got the future right. He's the best science fiction writer, and as far as being a prophet goes, he actually nailed it. Nobody else did. And he said, "Sex plus technology equals the future." Where in the '80s, when it was, do we have Betamax VCRs or VHS VCRs? The porn industry wanted VHS, so the world went along with it because of economic drivers. And what he's saying there is that the science fiction would say that, oh, wow, in the future, we'll have this ability to ABC. But in reality, all of this technological money and interest goes to sort of, you know, um, like the amount of technology we've invested in curing male pattern baldness is much more than we spend eradicating crippling
And it
disease.
still hasn't worked. I mean, look at me.
Right, right. What's the deal? You know? So it's funny to think about how like you can like for example, if you won the lottery tonight and won $50 million, you'd still have the same bad habits and the same childhood traumas and the same bad memories. Like that wouldn't change, right? And whatever happens technologically, every human being does have these issues with desire, lust, and greed, and there are these desires that threaten to take you apart if you don't get a handle on them. regardless of your situation, right? So, like I said, the best antidote is to read books by dead people who will tell you that, yeah, I'm not unique. These things have happened before. Um, but also an important thing to think about, William Gibson, the science fiction writer from Vancouver who wrote Neuromancer and all that, um, he said, um, the future is already here. It is just not evenly distributed.
Hmm.
Okay. Now, when he said that back in the 20th century, way back then, people said, oh, yeah, what that means is that, like, Bill Gates has gadgets in his house where, like, he can wave his hand and the paintings on the wall change. Instead of a Rembrandt, you're looking at a Van Gogh just by, waving his hand, right? Like magic, right? And so he has all this technology that I don't have, and maybe it'll filter down to me eventually, right? And that any technology you've heard of, the American military had it 30 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Like they had an internet in the 70s, but it only went from like Phoenix to San Francisco or whatever, right? So there's some piece of technology that the military has tonight that you won't hear about for decades, right? But what William Gibson's quote also means is that there are different pockets of Earth that have different things going on, and which is your future and which isn't. Like, for example, in the province of Ontario tonight, there are 24 communities that have boil water advisories where they say you can't drink the water here because we don't have the ability to deliver safe water to drink to these communities. And these 24 communities are all like First Nations people. So nobody cares, right? Nobody cares. So because it's just a given that First Nations people don't have the same access to clean water that normal people do, and people just go along with it. So the question is like, which is your future, the Jetsons, or will your community have a boil water advisory in 30 years, right?
Hmm.
So on the one hand, society is changing very quickly, and like things are breaking down in terms of infrastructure wise and competence. So William Gibson's quote has a different meaning now, where it's like, yeah, what side of the future will you be on, right?
Yeah. Well, and then there's that whole conspiracy theory as well that the Flintstones and the Jetsons take place in the same world, and the Jetsons live in the clouds, and the Flintstones live on the ground. It's just a very interesting dichotomy of like, also, if you think about it, we have jet planes and lasers and the internet and satellites and all this stuff. And then there's the people that still live on North Sentinel Island that are literally in the Stone Age still. And so you're right, the future is not evenly distributed when you put it like that.
That's interesting. Cool.
So let's go on to your work finally. Now that we've mentally masturbated about all these things,
Sure.
So your sixth poetry book, Alien Phonics Primer.
Yes.
Technology is making it harder for us to communicate about the most important things in life. How to resist. So where'd you come up with such a crazy title, and what exactly does Alien Phonics Primer mean?
Well, I've been told that crazy titles are my specialty now. And for me, at the time, it seemed quite logical, where basically um, I wanted to talk about how technology is making it more difficult for people to talk to each other about the most important things. So that's why it's called Alien Phonics Primer. Like a primer is like a grammar. So it's like, how do you talk to aliens, right? So basically, it's about that. It's about, um, again, uh, whatever promises the technology gave us in the 20th century about living on Mars, having robot maids or whatever. It's now clear that we are in this future. Whatever their putative cover story was, the bottom line purpose of this technology was to estrange us from our neighbors.
Hmm.
Where certainly my parents have memories of living in community where they lived on a street where everyone had things in common. They shared values. They didn't lock their doors. They knew everyone, right? And now it's not like that, right? So we are very much estranged from each other in a way that historically is a very new thing, right? So it's called Alien Phonics Primer because it's kind of ringing the alarm about that and about
Mm.
how do you talk to people, right? How do you break
Yeah.
through? You know?
Well, it's interesting you bring up your great titles because I loved some of the titles of this poetry.
Thank you very
Um,
much.
some of my favorites were "That's Not a Pinata, That's a Hornet's Nest," and then also "Parachutist Impaled on a Rhino's Horn." And there's a trick with the guillotine I've been working on, and
Right.
so many of them. I loved all the titles; they're so catchy. So, do you start with the title and kind of work backwards, or do you pull a title from the body of the poem after you finish? Some of them I read, I did find the title inside the body, but I don't know what your plan was.
Man, I'm kind of grateful for you to ask this question because it's nice that you actually read the book and got that out of it. That's pretty cool. Uh, to be
You're
honest, I
welcome.
always write the title last, always. And this book, I've always been inspired a lot by a painter named Rene Magritte, who I think was very smart, very interesting, and uh, he had a good relationship between his titles and his paintings. And there was another painter named Odilon Redon who did the same thing. And I thought, why not do that, right? Where if you write a poem about a dead dog and call it Dead Dog, there's nothing extra you're getting from that. So why bother having it there, right? So the title is another way to talk about the subject from a different angle or totally give it another slant and just start the party a bit earlier, you know. So also, I hope people find the book funny because it made me laugh when I was writing it, and I think humor is challenging to write. Like, um, like if a joke either works or it doesn't. Where if you watch a drama, you can make the case this way or the other. But if you watch a comedy and it doesn't make you laugh, it's a 0 out of 10. It didn't work, right?
Mm.
So I think a lot of and like jokes are about structure very much, and so is a poem. So I like thinking about uh, the structure of the poem, getting in, getting out, and the title is just another way to sort of hit that mark. Yeah.
So, what was your writing process for these then? Like, what was the time of day that you wrote these? What was your state of mind? Did you have a goal? Because the style is very raw. It's almost like stream of consciousness in a lot of these, and they feel. I don't know if you're planning on going through and perhaps editing these in any way. If I got like a rough draft, or if this is the final draft, because it just feels very like this is what's in my mind at this particular second, and I'm putting it down.
Do you think they need to be edited? Because
Well,
I
so
I think
no,
that
I,
ship
I
has
don't
sailed.
necessarily think that. I think so. So if this was prose, then yes, but I fully understand it's not prose. It's poetry, and poetry you can take all sorts of creative liberties, and I think it's completely fine to do that, and that you've done that. The English major in me saw that there was no capitals, and I started going like this, but it's okay for poetry.
Okay.
So
Well,
yeah, so again, very stream of consciousness, and I'll restate the first question, which was like, what is your writing process? What is your state of mind when you write this, and do you have a goal?
first I'll get back to you mentioned stream of consciousness, and after I'd been writing poems for a while, I thought, wow, this is a great way to talk about what it's like to actually be alive and have conscious states, more so than movies or anything else. And what I mean is, like, in a poem, as long as each line has some sort of is vivid and interesting and and the whole structure has some sort of logic. I mean, anyone who reads my book has heard of rock music, and in rock music, if you say "Bebopalula, she's my baby," "Bebopalula," I don't mean maybe. No one says, "What do you mean?" They just like bob their head and say, "Yeah, I get it, right on." So it just seemed like a good poem is. they use rhythm and meter to sort of sneak under the wire, where as long as it's pleasing to the ear, and then the whole proceeding has this inevitability to it, right? Like some drunk guy in a bar pouring out his life story to you, and it just feels really like inevitable, right? So then I thought, so you can bounce around in a poem more so than in a movie or something. And what I mean is, let's say you write a poem where you're going to the store to buy butter, because you need butter, but along the way, you remember someone you knew 20 years ago, and then you think about a fictional character. And isn't it interesting that it's as easy for you to daydream about the past as it is about the future? It's as easy for you to remember fictional people as real people. That's interesting. So
Hmm.
if you write a poem, as long as you've done your homework with the rhythm and meter and the imagery and the structure, you can bounce around in a way. And like maybe you call it stream of consciousness, but for me, it's just more like, yeah, this is what it's like to be alive. Where I'm sure you've had the experience today of some thought will enter your head, and like you like to think you're in the driver's seat when it comes to your consciousness. But you'll be driving and suddenly start thinking about someone, and then you'll think like, why am I thinking about that person? I wasn't thinking about that person. Why can't I stop thinking about that person? I haven't seen this person in 17 years, right? And
Yeah.
that's what Marcel Proust called involuntary memory, where you'll smell something and it brings back some memory that you certainly hadn't planned on thinking about that today, but welcome to Earth, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I have recently started trying to dip my toe into the practice of mindful meditation and just closing my mind to everything. And boy, my mind just does not shut up ever.
Yeah, yeah.
Always just random even if I'm consciously trying to think about not thinking, it's just a flood of things.
Yeah,
Um,
see, but I say kind of lean into that, right? Like, you know how you can drive yourself crazy with questions like, who am I? What does it mean to exist, right? And the funny
mhm,
thing is, and like, what connection do I have with the self from like the year 2000, right? Um, when, if you think about it, when you say, like, questions of identity are about, uh, uh, relationships where if I say, who am I? It's like, I have a wife who's a certain person. It's not just any person. And if I had dementia and didn't recognize my wife, that would really be an attack on my personhood, right? And we like to say, I have memories, when it's much more true to say, we are memories. Like,
mm,
my wife walks in the room, I remember who she is, you know, your memories are you, right? So you have these thoughts, and um, that first person experience of being, shocked by the thing you're thinking. That's like, pretty much where it's at,
mhm. So real quick, one final question on this stream of consciousness writing.
right?
Was any editing done on these, or is it on the page as it came out of your mind, or did you like revisit it and finesse some things?
Yeah, I guess maybe questions about the technical side are a good way to go. Part of that is the fact that this is my sixth book, where I've been doing this for a while, and I might not recommend what I do to people who are starting out. But once you've done your homework and have researched the Western canon and written a lot, it's a common process that artists go through, where once you sort of master the craft side of things, um, you tend to want to get, unless you want to spend your life repeating yourself and just do the same thing over and over again, which some people do. But if you don't, to make it interesting, you want to challenge yourself by doing different things. And the joke in the 20th century, people would look at abstract art and say, LOL, my 5-year-old could do better than that. What is this crap, right? But the real joke is all of the great abstract painters of the 20th century, whether it was Mark Rothko or Picasso or Vasily Kandinsky, they all started out as being masters of representational art. And Claude Monet was making big money when he was a teenager doing caricatures of celebrities. And they all had this common trajectory of veering towards abstraction as the decades went by, just because they were geniuses who wanted to challenge themselves, right? So uh, I like to think, well,
You're a
basically, the
genius that
first,
wants to challenge yourself.
sure, and some people don't, like I said, like some people just like find some shtick that works and lock into a style or something, right? But one thing I can say, my first book of poetry had a fair bit of autobiographical elements in it. And like, I'm sad, I'm heartbroken, I'm lonely, right? And then after that was done, I thought, my God, I don't know the future, but I know I don't want to ever do that ever again, where I want the books to be more imaginative, touch on universal things more. And I like to think every book I do, I make it harder for myself, where uh, to get back to your question, um, when I was writing this book, I didn't know what I was doing, and I certainly didn't want to. And I know there are writers who start with the ending, like the butler did it or whatever, and then work back from there. And for me, I always thought if I had a story worked out in my head, why would I bother writing it? I would just think about it.
Hmm.
And for me, the whole point of writing a book is to be surprised. And I was always a big believer in that if you're surprised by how your book turns out, there's a much better chance that the reader is going to be surprised.
Hmm.
And, I mean, I had a friend once who interviewed John Le Carre, the spy novelist, and he asked him some technical question about the structure of one of his novels, like the real, ligaments under the surface. And John Le Carre, who was, no idiot savant, he was a very smart man. He said, basically, that's not a question for an artist, that's a question for a critic. And he said, I don't know the answer to that question, and I don't want to know. And he was
Hmm.
sort of saying that he was worried if he thought about his process too much, all the magic might slip out the back door.
Yeah.
So my process with this book is I'd go to a secret spot I have at the local library and just have a notebook and just start writing. And if people want to know how to be a writer, that's literally the answer. Just start writing
Yeah.
and make a list. Make a list of things that bother you. There's a conversation you had back in the day that just gets under your skin. You can't stop thinking about it. Go there. You know, just make a list of things you notice, and then just start. And then poetry, you have to be very meticulous. You want to write a good poem, not a bad poem, which means there are certain things that aren't matters of personal preference. There are like things you have to get right, and it does require a lot of focus of a certain sort. So for me, I find I look for opportunities where I can let spontaneity pop back in, which is kind of what you're noticing there. Where, assuming you know the craft side of things, if you're writing a line of poetry and it happens to remind you of something else, then you can just go for it, right? And so I would sometimes just scribble things, and as soon as you start putting them into lines and it gets some structure, then there's some sort of internal fairy tale logic that kind of takes over. But yeah, and also like what you're commenting on is just me sort of trying to comment on the way minds work. Like like think about what you were saying about trying to control your thoughts or trying to turn your thoughts off, right? Or like what you think about what you're thinking, right? So life is
Yeah.
funny, and I thought, why not just you know lean into that strange experience of having an experience.
Yeah. I think art in general, not only writing, not only poetry, but art in general is a very meta experience. You're commenting on the experience of experiencing things. And your poetry certainly does that very well. So I think you've hit the nail on the head with that.
And
Um,
thank you very much.
you do have a lot of references to current culture and lifestyle, including but not limited to Star Wars, The Green Lantern, Motel 6, and DoorDash.
Yep.
So, do you mean for this poetry to be read 100 years from now as a picture into our current reality, or is this meant for contemporary readers to consider themselves?
Well, if it might stroke my ego to think that my poetry will be read 1,000 years from now. The
I said
way
100. Let's not get ahead of ourselves.
10,000, 10,000, you said. Um, well, uh, seriously, every artist has to play the hand that they're dealt. Where if you read my books, this is the sixth one, like I said, you can tell, like pretty obviously, there are certain things that I'm obsessed with. And to write really well, you have to go to that hotspot and write what you're obsessed about or like what your experience is, right? Like, for example, I'm a big fan of the Godfather movies. I know all about them. Um, but I'm not Italian and I'm never going to be. So if I wrote a mafia story, it would be inauthentic, right? Because that's not me, right? And Western movies in the 60s with people like Sam Peckinpah. Sam Peckinpah made the best Westerns, and his grandparents were literally pioneers. And Sam Peckinpah was literally putting shoes on horses when he was like in diapers, right? That was his world. That was his authentic experience, right? So, um, so I happen to be a certain sort of person who is living in a certain sort of neighborhood with a certain sort of obsessions, and you have to find out what your obsessions are and just go there, right? And in answer to your question, if you read The Divine Comedy by Dante, it's fantastic, but every page is full of him putting down a diss track to someone he knew in real life, where every page is full of like him insulting people that he knew personally who had pissed him off. So it's great poetry, but it's also this guy who had a grudges against these dudes who, and he's having his sweet revenge by fantasizing about how they'll be tortured in hell, right? So if you want, you can spend your life reading the footnotes to the Divine Comedy to find out who that he was referring to in this line here, but you don't really have to. Um, and and again, with writing, you want to find the specific detail that sort of encapsulates a moment. And I know in my writing I talk about Lego a lot, and one thing I was concerned about was the way our culture replaces the authentic experience with a shitty simulation, and the way real things are replaced with cheap plastic imitations. So I thought, how do you talk about that without sounding like a sermon? And for me, Lego was like a metonym where if I just thought if I dropped it in there, and then people might subconsciously think, "What's with all the Lego?" And they might think, "Yeah, like things do feel plastic. Our experiences are getting kind of more synthetic." And the way you mentioned like DoorDash and whatever else, um, it's just a reality that huge amounts of our mental landscape have been colonized by big corporations and powerful groups who don't have our best interest at heart. So, one thing I'm doing there is by talking about it, maybe some reader will notice where it's like, oh, yeah, just try to go for 5 minutes without seeing an advertisement, right? That's odd, you know. Um, for the past 2 million years, that wasn't normal, right?
Yeah. Okay. Did you want to read an excerpt?
Sure, yeah. But yeah, so you're asking good questions, and there's different ways to take them. But if you're looking for a soundbite, maybe I'd say, um, "The world is so strange. Why shouldn't my books also be strange?" or something like that. How's that?
That's perfect. I'll clip that.
Okay, so I'm going to read a page. This is called The Western Wind. Uh, Download self-help PDFs. Draw a plan, a map, mutant stickman Power Rangers, Bible battle scenes with transhuman color schemes. End up somehow neck deep inside the jasmine bush, gacked out and speeding on the excruciating sweetness of it all. This explains why I missed the bus. The ladder of success, just firewood now. And my graduating class voted me most likely to stop reading before the end of this sentence. And who needs a car anyhow when wind is free and I can stretch out my wings and catch a westward breeze? It's even easier down by Coots Paradise Marsh with wind whipping off the lake and the old lift bridge conscripted into the NAFTA superhighway, groaning under the weight of GDP boosting supertankers. But even parliamentarians must bow to the transcendental. I cheered when the buckthorn and prickly ash popped holes in all their grand plans. The future is ours. Here comes that western wind again. Fog etched grace notes hitch a ride.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
I do have one question. So you mentioned earlier the humor in your writing, which I did see a lot of humor and I liked it. And in this particular poem, there was one. Perhaps tell me if this was actually you, but you said that you were voted most likely to stop reading before the end of this sentence. So again,
Yeah.
humor thrown in there, but when you were in high school or whatever, is that the way that your self image was, or the way that you thought other people perceived you?
Uh, um, I don't know. I guess I don't have too much to complain about. If I think about high school, which I try not to, um, I think you might um, have thought I was um, a bit odd, maybe, or more into books than the average person. But uh, I think people were pretty generous and tolerant of my eccentricities. Um, but Um, One thing I did notice when I was keeping a dream diary is that now I'm pretty old, and when I was dreaming, I would never dream of, I would never have dreams where I was in my 20s or my 30s, but I would always have dreams I was in high school trying to pass grade 10 math, right? So I'd wake up and go, what's that about? Like, when I'm awake, I literally don't think about high school. And like there's 25 years of my life I never dream about, but I keep on dreaming about trying to learn math in grade 10, right? And it's kind of about, because high school is about, there's intense emotions, you're going through a big period of change, transformation, so it's a really intense thing where you're figuring out who you are. And like, Harry Potter was really successful for a reason, because talking about someone going from being an apprentice wizard to a master wizard is like a metonym for talking about going from being a boy to a man, which is something that everyone has in common. This like thing about, being in a state of drastic change, right? And like, who am I as I go through this drastic change and learning who you are? So yeah, and I vividly remember in high school the gym teacher saying, "Pay attention, kid, because these are the best years of your life." And I remember thinking to myself, "Good Lord, I hope not." And and it turns out, he was totally wrong. And I'm telling you, life gets way better as you get older. Just hang in there.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the direction I was going with that question is, if
Yes.
you truly were that kid who was quote unquote, uninspired to learning or didn't have a bright future ahead, what what advice would you give to people who are in that place now so that they can become writers and artists, and in the place that you're in your life right now?
Oh yeah, that's actually something I think about a lot, and I actually am fortunate now where I have a job where I talk to people who are in their 20s, and it's tough being young, right? Like
I know it's so hard.
it is, and uh, I'll be honest with you, like I'm 52, and it's great. And one of the great things about it is I know who I am. Like, um, I'm not going to run away and join the circus tomorrow or try to be a drummer or a trapeze artist or something. Like, I know who I am, right? And then when you're 20, you have people saying to you, "What do you want to do with the rest of your life?" You're like, I don't know. Why would I know that? My brain isn't even finished developing, right? So, first off, to anyone listening to this, I'm telling you, hang in there. It gets better. You just keep going, right? And I've certainly had a lot of people that I know personally in the past few years commit suicide, which is a huge epidemic in the Western Hemisphere that isn't talked about enough. And it's the worst, it's terrible. And I've had thoughts like that myself. I got through it. Things get better. Just hang in there. And one thing I have to say that this is one thing I actually believe strongly enough to be an evangelist for. Um, Read books by the great men of the past, because, like I said, they will tell you that you are not unique. Other people have felt the way you feel, like a misfit, hopeless, whatever. And, you know, these obstacles exist to be overcome, right? And one thing I would really recommend to people, to answer your question seriously, is study the life of Miguel Cervantes. Okay, so Miguel Cervantes, he wrote Don Quixote, and let's and it's a great book. Some say it's the best book ever written. He had a horrible life. He fought in the Battle of Lepanto, the biggest naval battle in 16 centuries, and he lost the use of his arm. So from the time he was 24 until he died, his left arm just hung at his side. Then he was in prison 3 times. He went bankrupt. Um, uh, he uh, he spent 5 years as a slave in North Africa, and when he was 61 and sat down to write Don Quixote, if he was a downer, you'd understand why. But when he was 61 and sat down to write Don Quixote and looked over his life and the human condition, he laughed. And that's how you win. If you can end your life on earth laughing, that's how you get to be a hero. So, uh, like he had one arm, he had terrible poverty. These like horrible things happened, but by taking his experiences and turning them into art, that was his way to refashion reality. And by laughing in the face of death, you can kind of touch on something transcendental.
Awesome. Well, any final comments, or is "you should go down laughing" your final comment?
Yeah, that's my final comment. Yeah, uh, seriously, just like uh, hang in there, and there's always beauty out there for you to marvel at and to document, as there always has been. So just lean into that. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, Darrell, thank you again for coming on. Everybody, we had Darrell Epp.